And we're on. Okay, welcome everybody. We're on Zoom today. Apologies, I'm getting everyone people in the room, but I didn't want to give up this class altogether, so I had to reschedule from last night, and I couldn't host in person today. So I wanted to have the opportunity still to study this week. First of all, because studying is always important, and not to lose an opportunity. But especially, I think this class we've discussed it, we've danced around it a little bit over the last couple of weeks. So I wanted to get this one in the Parsha of Tisa. So the Parsha breaks between two parshas beforehand discussing the plans for the Mishkan, and the two parshas following it, which discuss the implementation, the actual building of the Mishkan. And smack in the middle, we break for a little side story of the greatest sin in history, the golden calf. And it's obviously a very loaded story, and we'll get into it a little bit tonight. There's so much to say. I won't cover nearly. We'll touch the surface really. Um, just like there's so much to say about the Mishkan, but the golden calf. What happened? Why did it happen? What were the Jews really looking for? So just to go over the story, which we're all probably familiar with, and in the Chumash we're using here, Parshas Ki Tisa is on page 530. Sorry, 535. But the actual story of the golden calf, interestingly, I'll just tell you a small little side point. Every parsha is divided into 7 aliyahs, 7 readings, right? That comes from in Shul. When we read a parsha, there are 7 people honored to originally, historically, 7 people were honored to read the Torah. And when you were called up, you read that portion. But already a long time ago, most people weren't proficient anymore in just being, winging a Torah reading, uh, any given parsha. So they have a designated reader, and you called up, you make the blessing, and try your best to read along with the reader. But it's your reading; they're reading it for you. There are 7 people honored, which means the parsha is divided into 7 readings. Now, this division was by the rabbis, so there's sort of wisdom into how they divide the parsha, as opposed to chapters in the Torah are actually of the printer, the Christian origin. They don't come from a Jewish source, and therefore the division of chapters sometimes doesn't always fit the rabbinic narrative. And you'll find, interestingly, parshas end and aliyahs end in mid-chapter, right? A sentence before the chapter or after the chapter doesn't always align itself because of different ways of reading the text and how to break it up. But what's interesting about this parsha is the first 2 aliyahs are much longer than the rest. Is disproportionate, as opposed to being 7 equal aliyahs. Now, it's common that some aliyahs are longer and shorter, but this is almost, exaggerated. And the reason I heard for this always, and I don't know a source for this, but I'm sure there is because I've heard it for years. It's a beautiful idea. The golden calf, there was one section of the Jewish people, one tribe, who did not participate in this mistake, in this colossal mistake, and that was the tribe of Levi, the Levites. That's how they earned themselves the priesthood. Since they didn't participate, and the firstborns who were supposed to be the priests did, therefore the firstborns lost their right, and the Levites, the Levies, became the elevated class of Jews. Some of them, the Kohanim, priestly family, were the ones working the temple, and the Levites were the ones supporting them in that work. They did not participate. So when we're reading this parsha from the Torah, the rabbis wanted, who should read this? They wanted a Levi. Someone from the tribe of Levi should read this to avoid the shame, instead of someone whose ancestors would have been participants in this sin. And so the first 2 aliyahs go to a Kohen and a Levi, and then the next 5 go to a regular Israelite, to Yisrael. And so they push these aliyahs as long as possible to incorporate the story of the golden calf into the first 2 aliyahs, and then the next 5 can come. And so,
interrupt for 1 second. Just
yeah, sure.
The actual telling of the golden calf, does that occur in one of the first 2 aliyahs?
Yes.
Okay.
So the golden calf story is chapter 32, verse 1 begins. and it's in the second aliyah. And the first, if you want to know exact number of verses, I don't know them, but it's something like 45 verses for the first aliyah, and then the second aliyah goes for it's long, 50 verses, 45 verses. So each one's 45 verses, but in context, the average parsha is 120 verses, 100. So it's very long, 90 verses between them, almost a full parsha length. But chapter 32 is our focus tonight. So, and there's a lot of parsha besides this, by the way, which we're going to just gloss over just to give this focus, to zero in on the golden calf. But as we're going to see, it very much relates to the Mishkan at large, which is why perhaps it was situated right here in the Torah, sandwiched between the plans of the Mishkan and the implementation of the Mishkan building. So let's zoom out a little bit and ask the most basic question, I guess, or two questions together. How and why? We'll start with the why. Why would the Jews make a golden calf? What were they hoping to achieve? What was their intention? Like, why were they barking up this tree in the first place? That's question one. Question two is, how could they have been so blasphemous in such a short time after receiving the Torah? They had witnessed the greatest miracles. They had witnessed God himself, the revelation at Sinai, just a few weeks prior, less 6 weeks beforehand. The most awesome event in our history, to the point that our whole religion today stems from them. Thousands of years later, we are dedicating our lives to something which was brought into being at that moment. Our whole Judaism is because our ancestors experienced revelation at Sinai. And they witnessed it firsthand. And barely 6 weeks later, they created a golden calf. How could they have done that? How could they have lost their faith so quickly? How could they have been so unfaithful to God? And if you want to suggest they didn't think it was so bad, it's the second commandment. The second commandment, which they themselves heard, are the first two they heard from God. The other eight from Moses, they can say maybe it's corrupted, maybe, even though they fully, accepted everything. The first two they heard from God, and God said, do not make any graven images. Right? And there's actually two explicit verses till now we've read that have this. One is in chapter 20, which is the Ten Commandments. I want to read those verses just to see how clear it is that this is a breach of the contract they had with God, of the covenant. So in the Ten Commandments, the second commandment reads, I'll read the English from here. You must not make for yourself a sculpted image, any likeness of anything in the heaven above, or earth below, or in the water below in the earth. So forget serving the idol and worshiping it. You're not allowed to make a graven image of any being that exists in the heaven above, the earth below. Kaf is definitely an image of a being which is on the earth below, right? And then again, we have, I think in chapter 24, when the second narrative, the Ten Commandments. No, sorry. Right after the first telling of the first commandments, in chapter 20, verse 20. So the Ten Commandments have finished Revelation. One of the first things God tells him again in verse 20, you must not make a physical representation with me, idols of silver, idols of gold, You must not make for yourself. So very kind of directed, almost exactly what they were doing. Don't make an image of anything. Don't make out of gold. Do not do that. And here the Jews go and do it. So that's the questions we want to address almost from a psychological perspective or a sociological perspective. What was going on? Any initial thoughts about these two questions, the how and the why?
What always comes to my mind is how hard faith is.
Okay. So as obvious as could have seemed, faith is that hard, and it still was a challenge.
And also the drive to materials, see something material as proof, versus an abstract, we'll call the word concept, for lack of a better word, something that is just purely abstract. I did read a little bit that just the other day that the calf or the cow or the bull was a symbol in Egypt, an idol in Egypt, and it showed that perhaps that the people still were yearning to go back to Egypt, where it may be lousy, but we knew it was we knew what life was like. We got a meal. We had shelter. We may have been beaten for for being slaves, but we kind of knew what the rules were. But all that to me says the same thing: how difficult faith is in the Jewish way. I imagine for Christians, it's a lot easier. They got a guy on a cross that they could see. We are just a purely abstract concept.
So they kind of yearn for the pagan idea, which gives you much more control.
Right.
They know where things stand, and which is the same argument. Just go back to Egypt because we know where things are. We know what life is. Okay. Anybody else have some thoughts?
They like cows.
They like cows. Okay.
I think it's on the same vein as what Greg is saying. I think they were slaves for so long. They understood the concept of a god and the worship of a god, even though Judaism is monotheistic. I think that they understood that concept of you pray to an idol. And even though they were being told, do not make graven images, I think they still, it was kind of something that I don't think they really understood that. So they were using what they did know, what they had seen, what they were, you know, um,
That makes me
Okay.
think that the idea of thinking they knew better, in fact, not accepting the yoke of heaven, always makes me think that okay, there is God, but we know what to do. We know the rules. We know what's best.
right.
And also how hard it's a paradigm shift, what they were
Yeah.
experiencing, and there's a lot involved with the paradigm shift psychologically and socially, and the
Okay.
acceptance of it.
Yeah. So they weren't yet. They weren't there yet.
They weren't there yet.
Basically.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
I
They were,
think I
yes, they
think
weren't there.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
I think also they had seen this in Egypt for so many generations. All of these
It was so
idol
embedded, right? It was so
statues.
ingrained in them. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Robin. Rita?
Could they have been testing God just to see what would happen if they disobeyed?
Interesting. Interesting. So like a child, right? Kind of pushes the
Yeah,
button to see how far we can
I'm
go.
gonna do it.
All right, interesting. I actually never heard that suggestion before, and I mean it's curious. It's interesting.
It's a very interesting idea. Yes.
It's intriguing. I will think about it.
I never thought of it that way either, but when I think of my son, that makes sense because
It makes sense, right?
I could tell him no and he'll just do it anyway. So yes.
So
And almost
actually
intention.
an interesting thing I'm gonna mention. I'm gonna mention it soon. I'll mention it now. The Talmud is so perplexed by this question that it actually reaches understanding, and it supports it with some verses that God at this moment suspended the Jews' free will. And actually, it makes no sense. No human being would have ever done this. It was kind of they were possessed to do this act. And the reason is God wanted, right at the beginning of our history, to teach the Jews and the future Jews the power of teshuvah, repentance, that even the gravest sin, they can do kapara, they can be a cleansing. And so, not that they were testing, but God was kind of forcing them to test to show the limits and boundaries of sin, that it can always be a kapara, always be an atonement. So along those same lines, the Talmud does suggest something, that it was done in order to see how far this would go and what the consequences would be. So there's definitely merit to that.
That's so interesting, because I realized that my perspective was totally human from our side, whereas I should have realized, hold on, God created, nothing happens by chance. I should have been thinking, okay, why did God allow this or cause this to happen? What was the purpose of it? And that's what the Talmud is discussing.
Yeah. So I want to look at two different possibilities, and both are from the context. One from a more narrow context of this story itself, and one from a broader context of the larger story that was going on at that time. The narrow context, if you look at the verses, actually the Jews are pretty clear what they're looking for and hoping for, and they were not hoping for a God. Why are they making this idol? Why are they creating this golden calf? Because Moses said, I'm going to be back in 40 days' time. I'm going to the mountain. I'll be back in 40 days. The 40 days come and Moses has not arrived. Now, they made a mistake in calculation. Is the first day considered the first day, or starts 40 days the next day? So they thought the 40 days are up and Moses is gone. And the Midrash even says that the sky's blackened and there was all these symbols in that Moses is dead. And so they panicked because they were a young nation. Every step of their way, true, God had been doing, but guided through Moses. They never had access to God directly, besides the Sinai where they fainted. Moses came from Egypt. Moses performed the plagues. Moses split the sea. Moses was the go-between between God and the Jewish people. And without Moses, they were lost. So the Jews panicked. And the verse clearly says, chapter 32, verse 1, the people saw that Moses had delayed in coming down from the mountain. And they said, let us make a leader who will lead us, because this man Moses, who led us out of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So yes, later they worshipped this as a deity. That's true. But their original intent here seems very clear, was not to create a god. It wasn't an idol. They wanted a leader. Now, they didn't think any human being was fit to be a real leader, because every human being was the same as them, human. To be a leader of the Jewish nation needed to be someone godly, divine, someone who experienced God and can be that sort of go-between between the human being and God. Any one of them was just as human as the rest of them. Moses had experienced the revelation, face-to-face communication with God. He could communicate with them from a higher perspective, from a higher consciousness. They craved that kind of leadership. And they felt the only way they can achieve that is through making this golden calf.
Why is that not an idol then?
Good question. It was, at the end of the day, an idol. But what is an idol? It was not meant to be a god. Imagine we create this machinery. We can call it AI. That is almost sentient or seems sentient, and it has the brilliance to collect all the information in the world and give us clear answers and direct us. And the perfect answer to life will be summed up in instance. And so we begin to, I want to create this machine. We do not want to create it. So am I creating an idol? No, I believe in God. But my best way of serving God is by having this all-knowing or this kind of supernatural being that can communicate or lead me with this directive. So it wasn't a God. It had the potential to become a God. I'll tell you something fascinating. It's a side point, but I want to mention it because I think it's interesting. The Septuagint is the translation of the Torah into Latin. And the story goes, the reason it's called the Septuagint is because there were 70 rabbis who were tasked by King Ptolemy to translate the Torah into Latin. And this was a big deal because they were separated in different rooms and to see that it's going to be authentic, and they each changed certain things in the translation to avoid certain questions. And there was, even though they never sort of corroborated with each other, it came out the same. And the rabbis said it's a very sad day for the Jewish people. They created a fast day. What's wrong with translating Torah? It's considered a mitzvah to translate the Torah, give more people access. And so this is a big question, but the short of it is, it was the context. They were forced by a non-Jewish king to do this so that he and his people could have access to Torah and therefore be able to use it for their own means, to argue with the Jews and for whatever they wanted to corrupt it with. And so the Talmud, the expression the Talmud uses, that day was as sad, as tragic for the Jewish people as the day they created the golden calf. And you read it simply, it seems like the golden calf, worshiping the idol, was as bad as creating this translation. The Rebbe once had a beautiful talk where he suggested that's not the reading here. The Talmud means to say, in and of itself, wasn't necessarily so bad. Translating Torah is nothing bad. The same way creating this idol wouldn't have been necessarily an evil, but it lended itself to something negative. It gave the possibility to idol worship.
But
And so what made creating the calf so bad was what it opened, the door opened.
but that doors are, I mean, as we talked about, that the potential, that door's open with the Mishkan itself. And if you want to talk about potential,
Yes, I'm gonna get there in a second.
okay.
Okay, you're jumping the gun. Yeah. So that's in the sort of very narrow context. I would say the golden calf is meant to replace Moses. Somehow they felt this is going to create a leader, which can direct them and guide them. And obviously it was a colossal mistake. And it led to further mistakes where they actually worshipped it and created a day of worship the next day. So it got worse and worse. And then it led to the point where they actually blasphemed, they actually worshipped this God and offered sacrifices, and they called it Elokei, they called it their God. So it started off more innocent and led something much more sinister. That's in a narrow context of how they could have done it and what they were looking for. In the broader context, let's look at the broader context here. And here we get into a big debate. So we're in the context of building the Mishkan. And we've discussed many times the question whether Torah is chronological, and everything happens in order. And often we've found that things are out of order. And so the story of the golden calf is a very big debate between the commentaries where this fits in to the chronology of the parshas we're reading. And I'll mention two sides of the debate. I'll give them names, even though there's many other opinions in between and many supportive opinions to these two opinions. Rashi, which is the famed commentary, Rashi is generally more likely to accept that things are out of order. He uses it often to explain Torah. He seems to be more open to it. And he says the golden calf here is out of its place. Really? The golden calf mistake happened before the Mishkan was ever mentioned to Moses. Right after Sinai.
But to interrupt, but still after Moses, after we received the 10 Commandments?
Yes. They received 10 Commandments, then the golden calf, then Moses goes back, asks forgiveness, then Yom Kippur, the second tablets, and then the Mishkan. So in Rashi's reading, this story precedes Mishkan. Another commentary, the Ramban, Nachmanides, and many others as well, don't look at it that way. They say, why is it right here in Torah? Because it's exactly where it belongs. Right after God commanded to build the Mishkan, before the Mishkan was actually built, the Jews created a golden calf. And so, in a sense, we can say, in Rashi's reading, the Mishkan is a response to the golden calf, perhaps. Not necessarily. It could be what's going to happen anyways. But the Mishkan is in response to the golden calf. In the Ramban's reading, the golden calf is a response to the Mishkan. Now, there's nothing to suggest this is 100% true. It could be just that's what happened. But
could it also be unrelated? Could it also be unrelated?
It definitely was going to be a Bet HaMikdash. It was going to be a temple no matter what. And the Mishkan was going to be in the plans. But it was definitely the context Torah is trying to tell us that somehow it's coming to in follow-up to this. And I want to explore both of these suggestions a little bit and see where they leave us. There's a lot to say on this, and I actually was thinking about this question for a couple of weeks and did a lot of research. Yesterday, I lost my notes, but I think I still have a pretty good read on it. But there's a lot of different very interesting ideas here and parallels, and we'll get into a little bit of them right now. So buckle your seatbelts, and here's a little bit of what this might mean in either of these suggestions, whether the Mishkan came first or the golden calf came first. I want to first suggest the golden calf came first, Rashi's reading, which means the Jews worship the golden calf. Doesn't explain why the golden calf happened. It may explain more about the Mishkan. So the most obvious section of the Mishkan where the golden calf relates to is the Cherubim, the Cherubs. And so we mentioned this a couple weeks ago. In the centerpiece of the Mishkan was the Ark, which was a box that housed the tablets and the broken tablets. On top of the Ark, there was a cover of gold, which had attached to it 2 cherubs. It's not clear what these were. The Talmud suggests they were angelic figures. Some understand they were kind of birds with wings. Some people suggest they had the likeness of a child. Some commentators suggest it was a male and a female figure on there, and sort of symbolic of the intimacy between God and man. And so what these figurines, these golden figures were is unclear. But they were golden figures, which were the centerpiece of the temple, which is very curious and strange, as Jordan pointed out before. We're up in arms. How could the Jews create a golden calf? Well, God commanded to create golden figures. They're going to be the centerpiece of the temple. And so whatever question you have on the Jews, you have on God. How does this fit with the scheme, with the mitzvahs he's giving us? And then he throws a curveball. He says, the worst possible thing, 10 commandments, do not create a golden image. But, my friends, create a golden image. What's going on? So this is a huge question, which all the commentators are bothered by and try to weave their way through. The most obvious suggestion is the difference is one was commanded by God and the other is not. And that is, God somehow, for whatever reason, we'll get to it in a minute, made an exception with the cherubim. And for whatever reason, but anything outside that exception still has the weight of the commandment not to create anything, an image. And so when the Jews created an image, that was their own creation. It wasn't commanded by God. No exception, no amendment was made. Therefore, they were in violation of the commandment. Whereas when God commanded this in the ark, he gave this leniency. He gave this loophole, which, okay, it's a technicality. Doesn't explain why. Doesn't give us any insight into why God would want a golden figurine or figurines in a temple, right? So there's a lot to say here. What the meaning of these cherubim were, and why they featured so importantly in the temple. A couple of ideas I'll share. In the ark were the tablets, the Torah, the most important object really ever in history. I struggle to think of any object that has more significance, importance, value, worth than the tablets given by God, inscribed, became the beginning of the Jewish nation, religion. Where are you going to house this? Which vault are you going to put this in to keep it safe? That's the ark. And the cherubim were meant to symbolize the value and importance of these tablets. Whether the sort of childlike faces are meant to symbolize the sort of innocence we should approach Torah with, or some understand the cherubim to be protectors, which takes us back to a story in Genesis when Adam and Eve were thrown out of the Garden of Eden. The verse says that there were 2 cherubim, same expression, seemingly angelic figures that guarded the entranceway to the Garden of Eden with these swords, and no one get through. That once Adam and Eve were out, they're coming back. So the Keruvim are these guardians of sacred truth, and represented here, guardians of the Torah. And so, or another suggestion, Maimonides said something fascinating. He said, faith has many articles, many principles, what we're supposed to believe in. One of them, he says, is faith in angels. Without angels, he said, there's no prophecy. Angels are basically God's messengers. The idea that God has messengers or ideas that somehow can be communicated outside of God, an angel, is a fundamental of faith. And so one of these says, God made the exception here to show the Jewish people a symbol of angels, that they should have faith that there are angels, which means have faith God is not just outside there, he also communicates with us, which is so fundamental to Judaism that it had representation in the temple in the golden cherubim. So these are all suggestions about why it'd be so important to have these figures there, even though they were golden images. Now, if the Mishkan came first,
Interrupt you. They were images.
Yes,
They
sir.
also figurative. They weren't a round ball. They were figurative of some type of living creature, whether in the abstract realm or in the physical realm. He could have just said, make a golden ball like you make on a column as a ceremonial approach. They were figures.
well, these suggestions of why these figures represented, what the figures represented specifically, whether the guardians, whether angels, whether the sort of simplistic children, or the intimacy between God and man, which is a very powerful figure in the Holy of Holies, where there's this that's where the Talmud of the story when they destroyed the temple, the first temple, said that the Babylonians paraded the ark in the streets and mocked the Jews because it was a figure of a man and a woman, and in this sort of intimate embrace, and they mocked the Jews in the Holy of Holies. Look what you guys have, but it was kind of the Holy of Holies, is this intimacy, is this space. So the symbol is very much tied into the specific figure that was there. So if the Mishkan came first, or the commandment of the Mishkan came first, that there was this commandment, this notion the Jews heard about to create this golden cherubim, we can begin to forgive the Jewish people for wanting a golden image as a mode of worship. Right? They know that Moses was instructed to create a temple, a Mishkan, and they know the centerpiece is the ark, and they know on the ark there's meant to be this golden cherubim as a centerpiece of the holiest space in Jewish community. So now they're missing Moses. They want it, craving that kind of communication with God. It is so far-fetched that they create this golden image themselves. So if the Mishkan was first, we can begin to forgive the Jewish people. Not forgive, but understand where they're coming from. If the golden calf was first, we have no such notion. If the golden calf was first, the opposite. Some suggest, you know why God told him to make the cherubim? He saw the human beings needed this sort of golden figure to latch onto, and he gave them something. In the Holy of Holies, there'll be a golden figure, not directing you towards it, but directing you towards God. So, concession perhaps for the human need, like you said before, Greg, and a few others echo that, the human need for a tangible representative of God. So God made a concession in the temple, perhaps. So these are two suggestions, depending which way you look at the history. But I think there's something even deeper here that gives even greater understanding to all of this. And that is where we find the notion of cherubim elsewhere in Tanakh, in the Bible. We had one in the Garden of Eden, the cherubim, these angelic figures, guarded the Garden of Eden. There's another mention of cherubim in the biblical literature, in the Bible. And that comes from a prophecy of Yechezkel, Ezekiel. Ezekiel has one of those profound cosmic prophecies known in rabbinic literature as Maaseh Merkava, the chariots, because he describes God's chariot, which is an incredible sort of spiritual meditation in its own right, where he describes what he saw in the heavens and the chariot of God. Ironically, the Talmud says that Ezekiel had the lowest level of prophecy. How do we know that? Because he told us what he saw. I mean, the fact that he could describe it means that he wasn't really there. I mean, those that know don't say, those that say don't know. So the fact that Ezekiel could describe what was going on in the heavenly chariot means his prophecy was limited, even though we look at this as the greatest prophecy. But be that as it may, he describes the heavenly chariot, and he says on each side of the chariot there was a different figure. One had an image of a ox, image of a eagle, and I'm forgetting the others right now. And on top of that, there was a rider of the chariot, God, so the figure of a human, and then beyond human. So he discusses this imagery of the chariot that he saw. And the next time the same imagery is there, instead of the ox, or instead of the human, sorry, instead of the human face, there was a cherubim. One of the things in the chariot was the cherubim. Again, this notion of some kind of figure which was on that chariot of God. Obviously, everything in that prophecy is symbolic. There's no chariot, and God isn't riding anywhere, and he has no animals accompanying him. But whatever that sort of spiritual vision meant, it had that practical, physical manifestation or allegory to it, which now gives a greater understanding of what the cherubim were and what the Jewish people were trying to do with the golden calf. And the Midrash links these two, and he says something fascinating. What happened at Sinai? At Sinai wasn't just the Jewish people hearing a voice that resounded, a booming voice, like you're in a stadium. No. The Jews had prophecy, a revelation. Heaven was exposed, God was exposed. They experienced the divine. I can't tell you what that means. I've never had it. But I can imagine they had an experience of prophecy, an altered consciousness. They saw the chariot of Ezekiel. They saw the greatest spiritual truths they had experienced in that moment. And it was an incredible spiritual high. It was a moment of truth. It was an epiphany. It was this, everything suddenly fit in. Imagine for a moment you can glimpse at God. What does that mean, to glimpse at God? I don't know. But what might it mean, to glimpse at God? Is imagine just everything becomes clear. There's a system, and forget everything that we're bothered by. The things we're not bothered by. There's just clarity. Everything's open. Your purpose, the universe, the divine, and that moment of they literally passed out, because it's not possible to live in our world and also be conscious of that other world. But they had that moment of it, and after Sinai, they were seeking that experience, which is exactly what the Mishkan was supposed to be. Right? We spoke the other week that the Mishkan represented the permanence of the experience of Sinai, because the Jews wanted that closeness to God, that feeling of truth, of divinity in their lives post Sinai. And so the Jewish people had that moment, a fleeting moment of revelation, and then it was gone. And they were left with all the commandments. They were left with the duties that stem from there, but they no longer had easy access to the experience. And so the Mishkan meant to create some sort of permanent home for God, where they can experience God. Divine is manifest there. There were miracles there constantly. There was an experience of closeness to God just by entering that space. And so it was a material space that housed the spirituality of God, which was the experience of Sinai. So the chariot that they would have seen then was something they associated with the divine. So the Midrash says something very interesting. It says God says the Jewish people came to Sinai and they stole something from my chariot, which means like the golden calf was kind of they literally they pulled it out of the chariot. In other words, they took this idea where they stole this chariot, and somehow the golden calf has some sort of symbolic representation of divinity. Again, it's not about a calf. It's not about, you know, everything, especially in ancient cultures, there was so much symbolism that's hard for us to really digest. And the truth is, we have so much symbolism in our culture that maybe in the future that will be hard to digest. So I recently someone shared with me this example that I thought was very interesting. You have a football game, right? And Super Bowl, and the Eagles are playing. So you see someone in the street who's an Eagles fan, and they may have like a picture of an eagle in their jersey, or maybe even carrying wings to show they're huge Eagles fans, right? And you start looking and say, what's the meaning of an eagle? Are they worshiping some kind of pagan eagle? Is it No? In our culture, we're very clear. This is a symbol of a football team they go for. So there's a lot of symbolism which we don't even like pay attention to. It's so easy, it's so clear for us that this image is a symbol of something very different. But imagine in 500 years, looking at pictures and they're wondering, what's the symbolism of eagle worship in 2025? There was a spike in worshiping this eagle deity that suddenly people are posting about eagles and wearing eagle shirts. So they may be confused. So there's symbolism that is easy to misread. And so perhaps the Jewish people never meant to create a golden calf to worship this animal. They were very faithful to God, very aware, much more aware, spiritually aware than we were. They experienced Sinai. They were so close. And they craved that close. And they know they can't have God in a physical form. God's not physical. God's way beyond our experience. But the chariot, something manifesting that spiritual dimension, they can create and have access to. And so whether the calf came before the cherubim or whether the cherubim came before the calf, they both seem to be representations of the chariot of God, which means of the spiritual dimension of God outside of God itself. And so if the ark was sort of the house of God, the cherubim was a symbolic representation of his chariot, of his image, of his communication with us. God spoke to Moses from between the cherubim, the verse says. It was symbolic of God's communication with human beings. And it has a symbolism because it reflects a spiritual identity, which is Ezekiel's image of cherubim, or of the ox, the calf. So both the Jewish people then and God in the temple were trying to create this representation of the divine chariot that Ezekiel references. But that leads us back to the same question. Why was this okay and that not okay? We now understand with, I think, greater clarity about what this specific symbolism was and why it was so important to the Jewish people, to the point they were willing to risk everything to create the golden calf. And God was willing to risk the mistake of people making golden images to create the cherubim. People may look at the cherubim and say, "Oh, we can make golden calves." God was willing to risk that mistake to create the cherubim. We know why. The cherubim was such a great symbolism, representation of God's chariot. Before I, share something very interesting. So the second time the verse says not to create golden images, right after Ten Commandments. So Ten Commandments already said don't create an image. And then right afterwards, we have again, don't create any graven image, gold or silver. Why is it being repeated? Right after the Ten Commandments. Rashi has a very novel interpretation, which is in the Talmud, but it's a novel interpretation of the text. Rashi says that verse is not speaking about the same thing as creating a regular idol. The context of that verse is all about the cherubim. I'll read the verse too, and I'll read how Rashi reads it fascinatingly. So again, we're chapter 20, verse 20. The verse reads, Lo sasuniti, don't make anything with me. Elokei kesav kezav, gods of silver and gods of gold, lo sasulachem, do not make for yourselves. Okay, so Rashi says, Lo sasuniti, don't make with me, don't make any symbols of heavenly symbols, angelic symbols. Elohei kesef, silver, he says, do not make the kruvim out of silver. They have to be out of gold. Elohei zav, he says, don't make more than 2 of the golden kruvim. Lo lachem, don't crave for yourself, means the kruvim I'm allowing dispensation only in the temple. Do not make the same figures for yourselves. And so the 4 statements here, Rashi reads, they're all referencing the kruvim, and kind of God is very aware of the danger of creating the kruvim, and he is cautioning the Jewish people, warning them, don't make them out of silver, don't make more than 2, don't make them for yourselves. I'm allowing the kruvim, but make sure you follow their instructions exactly, because anything similar to them will be a colossal mistake. Now remember, in Rashi's reading, the golden calf came before the Mishkan. And so when the Mishkan came around, the Jews had already sinned with making golden images. So the Keruvim, God would have been very aware, saying, I'm letting you do the Keruvim, but do not understand this to allow you anything similar to the golden calf you had. But it's interesting because it's clear that there's an awareness of kind of the danger of the Keruvim they present. So here's my understanding of why this is so important and what the difference is. And it goes back to our original sort of thing I suggested, but gives a lot of depth. I said originally the idea is whether God commanded or it came from the Jewish people, which sounds very technical, but I think there's a lot to this. The Keruvim are the chariot of God, sort of a very intimate experience of God, symbolic of sort of divinity itself. We as human beings cannot create any image of God.
Symbol of divinity or the experience of divinity?
Well, the chariot of God, which is some sort of experience of divinity. Yeah. Not the divine of God, but some expression
With experience.
of God. Yeah. As human beings, we are dualistic. We can't sort of really recognize the oneness of God, how God is the being of everything, is the spirit of everything. We see the world as fragmented, we see the world as disparate. That's our perspective. And it's almost impossible to reach a point of real unity. The Holy of Holies is meant to be a space of unity. Kind of, there's holiness, go to the temple. Within the temple, there's the holy. Within the Holy of Holies, meant to be the space in the world where heaven and earth meet, where the tablets are. That's like the space of ultimate unity. The Talmud says that, crazy what happened there. The ark didn't take up space. And it was kind of had dimensions, but it also you'd measure from the ark to the wall. It didn't take up space, but it was taking up space. The whole Holy of Holies was this space of sort of beyond natural. It was a space where the oneness of God was manifest in a very plain sense. Within that atmosphere, within that experience, it's very clear the Keruvim, any graven image, any golden image, is an expression of God. It's part of God's being. It's part of God's communication with the Jewish people. Outside of that space, any attempt to create an image, even with aggressive intentions on creating a sort of a manifestation, a symbol of divinity, is always going to be flawed attempt. It's always going to be short, come up short. And therefore, if it's not going to be it, it begins to be the opposite of it. It begins to conflict with it. No, outside the Holy of Holies, outside of God's command in the Holy of Holies, any attempt for the human being to recreate this experience that they had at Sinai is going to be beginning from with us, beginning from the human, and never be able to really encapsulate and capture God. And therefore, it becomes an idol. Even if your intention is, this is my experience of God, but it's my creation of my experience of God, that is the beginnings of idolatry. God's creation of the experience of God. When God commanded in the space of the Holy of Holies, that does capture very well the symbolism, the imagery of the chariot. And this, I think, is a very fundamental idea that in our religious life today has a lot of resonance, which is why the story is very powerful. We are all, in some way or other, seeking this spiritual experience. Maybe not to the same degree our ancestors were at Sinai, but we're seeking meaning, purpose, to understand ourselves, understand the world, understand that we're speaking some sort of spiritual identity. That oneness, we want to just everything to make sense, to fall into place. I want to understand why things have to happen. We're seeking the spiritual meaning, the spiritual purpose. And we're tempted sometimes to latch on to something and create an image of it. I have the answer, and I'm creating a symbol of the answer I have. I'm worshiping that. In other words, this is how I found meaningful, and therefore I'm wrapping my Judaism, my faith, or even not for Jews, I'm wrapping my life around this answer that I found. This is where I find God. This is where I find my calling. This is where I find meaning and purpose. And I build a system around that, which seems very beautiful, very enticing, and even very holy. But ultimately, if it's stemming from your best understanding, first of all, in a couple of years' time, your understanding may change. So it's not ultimate, it's not absolute, it's not objectively true. But more importantly, any sort of you're creating God in your image instead of God creating a human in his image. You're limiting your God to one that you can create, that you could have thought of. You could have, this is, if I find it meaningful, it must be true. In other words, truth is whatever I could have imagined. I'm creating truth limited to my understanding of things. That's a golden calf. It's the best. You're aiming to create a God that's real. You want not to supplant God, not to get rid of God. This is my way of communicating with the God. I have best intentions in mind. We all do this all the time. Ultimately, it's somewhat, in a subtle way, a golden calf. Any sort of imagery, any truth you want to latch onto, anything you want to worship, has to be the way God set it out to be, even beyond your understanding. Now, it's still a golden image which we can relate to. I mean, God gave us a Judaism that's meaningful for us. It's not all blind faith. It's our relationship with this, relationship with Him, and finding meaning and purpose in our lives in the world. But ultimately, the root of it has to be in a space of the Holy of Holies. It has to be, I'm not putting all the eggs in the basket of my own awareness and consciousness and understanding. And if I'm going to build an identity of relationship with God, I want to give a practical, physical manifestation to that. It cannot be something that I created. It has something God created. And that's in the mitzvahs are all specific. Put on tefillin. You know what I find it more meaningful to pray with wearing something else, not tefillin. So good. Tefillin for many Jews works as a meaningful practice. But the way of relating to God is that. Beautiful. That's good that you have that awareness of yourself. It's very healthy. But ultimately, you're creating a golden calf. You're saying, I am looking to relate to God in ways that I find meaningful. And that's where I find God. You haven't found God, you've captured God, right? You're saying God has to be this that I'm experiencing now. Maybe God is much more than that. Maybe there's more to it than that. Ultimately, you found something. The Jews really found purpose and meaning in the golden calf. They worshipped it. But it was a misleading worship. But God said, I want you to pray and tefillin. You may not find it meaningful today. You may find it meaningful tomorrow. But this is the portal. God said, this is my image. This is the golden cherubim I'm asking you to make. And therefore, if you build a Jewish identity around that, even if it may seem, I'm also worshiping something that I don't understand, it's not meaningful to me. It may be a golden image, but it's a golden image that's in the Holy of Holies that God instructed. And so any image is unhealthy. God said, any image of me, anything where you captured me, I've got God, unhealthy. It's not Jewish practice. You're never going to capture it. But if you're going to find something to capture, if you need some sort of material manifestation, if you need tangible divinity, because we're human beings, then I'm going to tell you how it's going to look. I'm going to direct you how it can be. Anything outside of that is your own imagination, is your own limiting your Jewish experience, your spiritual experience, your divine experience.
But yet most of us are not allowed in the Holy of Holies, so that we are not permitted to actually experience the golden cherubim.
True. So the ark would go out to war with them. It was time to take it out of the Holy of Holies. And there's debate in the Talmud where there were two different arks. One stayed in the Holy of Holies, one would travel. One ark is unclear. Whether the ark with the cherubim would go out. Perhaps no one can see it, only know about it. Maybe you're right. And I have to think about what that means in this context.
Right.
Interesting.
It's a very powerful argument you're making. It's I don't want to say it's dangerous, but it leaves very little room to look at any religious ritual as worthy and in fact not dangerous unless it's, I mean, it just doesn't leave much except for like a very kind of hardcore traditional view. Like rituals that are meaningful are those that you believe come from God through the Torah. And if you believe anything else, if you believe these are rituals that evolved because it's a way for humans to regain intimacy, if you believe these customs are beautiful, even in the Jewish tradition or outside the Jewish tradition, either way, but they're not specifically like sanctioned literally by God, then
They're blasphemy.
then they're
They
blasphemy.
become blasphemy.
Yeah, that doesn't leave a lot of, I mean, it's dangerous. It's a very it's hardcore.
So yes, it's hardcore. I'll admit to that. I will say a couple of things. Number one is there can be things meaningful outside of mitzvahs, meaningful, and people find beauty in them, and that's fine, as long as you don't create a religion out of it, right? This is not my God. It's meaningful. It's beautiful. I'm not sort of limiting my spirituality to that. That's number one. Number two is I think these mitzvahs become the foundation, but then we build on that. And I want to discuss about that actually in the next couple of weeks. A very interesting idea when the Jews built the Mishkan. And the idea where human imperfection is part of the beauty of religion. That our way of practicing is not going to be what God necessarily imagined, but that's okay. It's even better than that. There's a beauty to the brokenness. So there's going to be the notion where we're imperfect and we have our own perspectives, and we're meant to be that way. We spoke about this a few weeks ago, the idea of instead of just following blindly, building a relationship. So there is supposed to be my own involvement here, what I find meaningful, where I find expression. And that's why, different people's Judaism will look different. That's all fine. As long as the framework and foundation is the same. And what we build on that and how we approach it is going to be very different, using our own personalities and ways of relating to things. But ultimately, yes, it may not be, again, the creation of the golden calf wasn't yet worshiping the golden calf. It was a colossal mistake because it gave room to worship the golden calf. So in itself, it's already a mistake. But the biggest problem was that what it led to and gave room to. And so finding meaning and purpose and creating something which wasn't directly commanded may not be a terrible thing in its own right. But what it leads to, and I think this plays out in a large way in many kind of people, it leads to building false gods and worshiping them, which only goes further and further astray. So I do believe ultimately, if a Judaism isn't rooted in commandments, in revelation from God and commandments, it's going to run amok, and it lacks that grounding, and kind of is beginning of the golden calf.
It strikes me that looking at the negative aspect of the golden calf is one thing. Then looking at the negative aspect of the golden calf, where previously Hashem said, make golden figures, adds another element to the golden calf. Also strikes me the word super rational, which Rabbi out here uses all the time, and it's in Torah as well. It seems like it could be one of those super rational things. God told me not to make golden calves, but God said, but make a golden object and stick it in the Holy of Holies. And guess what? You may never understand why, but I'm telling you to do this, but not to do that, even though they seem similarities. And maybe that's also part of an article of faith.
Possibly. So God was, the whole Cherubim was kind of test the Jews. Like, see how much you're gonna follow me. I said, don't do this. It's like almost like Abraham, right? Don't kill, but your son, slaughter your son. Like, how are you gonna follow this? Even though it makes no sense. That could be God was saying to Cherubim, I'm testing you how much you're gonna follow me, even though it's radical and nonsensical.
Right. I'm telling you not to do it. Now I'm telling you to do it. Do you really believe in me? Do you really trust me? I was reading, I get an email from a rabbi who follows Rav Kook, and he sends out comments on the Parsha each week. And on this Parsha, Rav Kook quoted from Exodus, and I'm going to paraphrase it. Hashem says, I gave wisdom to the wise. And the question is, well, if you're already wise, why do you need to give wisdom? And then the answer comes back, because only the wise can understand the wisdom that I'm giving to them. And somehow it strikes me also something's going on with when I, Hashem, tell you to make the golden cherubim and put it in the Holy of Holies where time and space is suspended, only the greatest tzaddikim, maybe only Moses, can understand why I'm telling you to do that. Because in contrast, I'm telling you not to make a golden image. And that strikes me as it needs to be very, very, very wise to understand what's going on here. Maybe very few really could understand it.
Possibly.
What did the Rebbe
We're all
say about
Moses here. We're all trying to understand it. So we're all on Moses' level here.
What did the Rebbe say?
About what? Which part of this?
Make 2 golden figures and put in the Holy of Holies. Don't make golden images.
So a lot of what I shared tonight is kind of some of it, not a lot. Some of it is
From the Rebbe.
comments from the Rebbe's talks. There's a lot. I mean, the Rebbe's commenting on thousands of years of Jewish traditional commentary that exists and kind of adding his nuance to it all. So, yeah, but this is definitely, I think a lot of it's borrowed, not directly the themes from the Rebbe's understanding.
It does strike me this is a phenomenal issue, or am I just exaggerating it?
No, absolutely. This goes to the heart of it.
But it was so inspiring that I have so many thoughts now. That was great.
Okay. I was tempted this week to talk about Purim instead of the Parsha, but I kept on track with Parsha. But I do want to wish you all a happy Purim. Tomorrow night, tomorrow is Tainus Esther, the fast of Esther. So we actually fast tomorrow from the morning, which with daylight saving time, we have some extra time in the morning to get up for coffee.
Tomorrow, Thursday morning on the English calendar.
Tomorrow morning begins a fast till nightfall. Tainus Esther, which we break the fast with a Purim celebration, reading the Megillah, and those that are local are invited. Tomorrow night we're doing a Megillah reading, and then Friday the Purim party. And we'd love to see you all celebrate wherever you are, though. Celebrate Purim. Hear the Megillah, the 4 mitzvahs of Purim. We hear the Megillah. We give gifts of food to a friend. So at least 2 gifts, 2 foods to a friend. There's something very beautiful about that. It's the only time sort of Judaism we have that peer-to-peer giving, which is an interesting thing. The role of community in Purim. Matanat Levyonim, giving money to the poor. And the 4th one is to have a festive meal. So to celebrate Purim in that way. Those are 4 ways we create the joy of Purim and make it real. These 4 actually, Mordechai and Esther, suggested in the Megillah itself are the ways of celebrating Purim. So since then, it's been the way we do Purim. So happy Purim. It should bring a lot of joy, celebration, and God willing, back next week on Tuesday. Back to regular schedule for the Parsha.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Nice
you
to
very
see
much,
everyone.
everyone.
Fantastic.
So,
All right, have
so
a good
great to
night.
learn with all of you. Thank you.
Chag Sameach.